Um, okay, hello. Good afternoon, everyone who's joining us from Bonn, and good evening to those who are in Asia, and good morning, and yeah, depending on the time where you are joining us from. Today, we have Dr. Youssef Nassef, who's the Director of Adaptation Program in the UNFCCC Secretariat. And he also has a few more titles with all the work he's doing at the UNFCCC. I will not go into details. I'll ask him to introduce and tell what he actually does so that he can tell what's most important to his heart. So, Youssef, over to you.
Thank you very much, Vositha. Thank you for having me here. I'm very happy to be on this program. And my name, as you said, is Youssef Nassef. I'm the director of the Adaptation Division now at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat. And I've been doing this job for over 20 years now, 21 years to be exact. Before that, I was a negotiator for my country, Egypt, in the climate change negotiations in the lead up to the Kyoto Protocol, and then joined the organization and initiated its work on adaptation from scratch. So it's been evolving ever since. And in addition, I'm temporarily also acting director of the department that oversees the negotiating process. So it's called the Intergovernmental Support and Collective Progress Division. So my hands are pretty full nowadays, but my heart lies with the issue of resilience.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Youssef, for joining us today. We are very grateful for finding 30 minutes of your time to join us and speak today on biodiversity and climate change impacts and also resilience. So I forgot actually to introduce myself. So I'm Vositha Wijenayake. I am the Executive Director of SLYCAN Trust. And we have been having sessions throughout the day focusing on biodiversity, and now we are moving to resilience and climate change linked to biodiversity. So first question, we've been speaking a lot about the interface between biodiversity, climate change, and today we are speaking about environment a lot. So why do you think this is very important? We are celebrating Biodiversity Day, so how do we highlight the importance of it?
Yes, I think the way we've been living our life so far has been characterized. I mean, the whole notion of modernity and consumerism has really alienated us a lot from the notions of nature and biodiversity ecosystems. And we no longer understand that connection between our daily life and, for example, where does our food come from and how and what the health of ecosystems contributes to our own well-being beyond it being, providing us with nice scenery. And I think the backlash from the earth to our bad and unsustainable practices and our seeing the visible effects of that backlash, most notably with the coronavirus outbreak that we're living through now, has really made this become a lot more important in people's minds, even though normally in their daily life, people living in cities and this fast-paced mode of life, maybe they do not see that link readily. But it has become very important in the minds of people, at least at the level of policymakers at the international level, especially after the production of the Global Assessment Report last year, which really highlighted the critical stage that we are at in our defunct relationship with biodiversity and ecosystems and the urgent need for transformation to happen. And that's, I think, why it has become quite important in people's minds. On the one hand, the science has been very, very forceful in the very recent past. And on the other hand, people are already starting to see the effects of what an unhealthy and unsustainable relationship with our natural support system can bring about. And so I'm hoping that, this multifaceted resurgence of awareness of the importance of us taking care of the support system that takes care of us would lead us to approach the whole notion of prosperity and of well-being and of wealth in a very different way from what has produced the problems that we are now facing. So that's it, really. I think we should have heeded that call a long time ago. I mean, ever since the 70s, we've been seeing acid rain, then after that, ozone depletion, then species extinction, climate change, plastics in the oceans, and now COVID-19. And it's not like it suddenly appeared out of nowhere. The signs were there. And unfortunately, the way the world works is that we often start reacting a bit beyond when it's too late. So let us hope that that some of the effects that have led to the raising of these awareness, we can still reverse some of our practices, because it's all about how our economic systems work and how we perceive our needs to be and how we prioritize what we want versus what the world needs in order to provide us with future wants. And so I think it's becoming a bit more obvious to more people that this issue is really important, and that's why we're seeing that resurgence coming up at the level of the media and the public, let alone the international negotiations level. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. So how does the work that you do in terms of UNFCCC and then the overlap with Rio Conventions, how does all this link up with the work that you do, and what are the overlaps in the processes that are existing, focusing on this?
Well, it's very interesting because, I mean, people often criticize the different international processes being disjointed from each other and going in different directions. But I think the resilience of ecosystems is one common element in all of them. They all converge on this, whether you look at the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Climate Change Convention and its Paris Agreement, whether you look at the certification or Sendai or SDGs or Ramsar. I mean, there's one common issue there, and the one common issue is the issue of ecosystem resilience. And we look at that maybe from different angles in terms of different negotiating processes, but it's both a context of problems as well as solutions. So in climate change, we look at ecological degradation as a problem that has to be solved, but we also look at the enhancement of sinks to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere as part of the solution, and oceans as well. I mean, these are components of the vulnerability to climate change, as well as one of the mechanisms to reduce the bad effects of climate change. So this is from this perspective. Of course, you find people working on disasters know about nature-based solutions for risk reduction in terms of extreme events, especially in coastal protection, for example, mangrove, seagrass, etc. People work in desertification, are looking at land degradation, which is, of course, ecological degradation as well. Biodiversity, their core issue is what we're talking about. The SDGs, a lot of them have a link to nature and to biodiversity. And so the issue there is that we're all trying to tackle the same thing, and hopefully in a way that builds on each other rather than contradicts each other. So another thing to bring up, I think, in this context is that so ecosystems, I mean, sometimes fall into that trap of being dealt with as a national issue, whereas we in many of these cases, the problem is global and the solution is global. And so therein lies the importance of these types of international mechanisms for us to work together on it. The context of climate change, we deal with it through very, very many different mechanisms. So one of the main instruments that we have to help countries enhance their resilience and adapt better to the bad effects of climate change is that of national adaptation plans. And countries, in preparing their national adaptation plans, would need to look at all their sectoral priorities, but a big component of that then is the notion of ecosystem protection. And when we look at the priorities that are appearing, it's usually water, food, and then ecosystems. But the water and food components themselves have a link to ecosystems. So in reality, it is sort of not a singular category, but it permeates through other categories as well. Beyond that, we have sort of a knowledge component, what we call the Nairobi Work Program, which then tries to break those silos, brings all actors together. We have around 400 partners, and they try to synthesize the existing knowledge, disseminate it, curate it, and try to advance it and fill knowledge gaps. And that is sort of on the science side, on the research side. I already talked about the national adaptation plans on the implementation side. And then we have a whole area of work on land use and on agriculture. So they look at it also not just from the adaptation perspective, but from the mitigation perspective. So how does one use land in a way that can reduce concentrations of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere? And then you get into the context of afforestation and reforestation and preventing deforestation. So that's another area of work. So within climate change, there's so much that goes on that relates to nature. And we talked about different organizations and different international legal instruments dealing with, but even within one of them, you have still a lot of different angles, because it's such a complex issue, I mean, not the least of which legally and politically and economically, in addition to from a technical perspective. So we cannot do this alone. Obviously, we have to engage with those that are looking at it from the different angles, and not just within the UN system, but also the research community and the finance community, the civil society, NGOs. So it's a huge endeavor, I think, and I believe we have not yet got the hang of it. And it's an evolving and moving target, as you've seen. I mean, we thought things were as bad as could be, but now we see the COVID-19 crisis, and there are calls for green recovery. There are calls for both green recovery in terms of low carbon, in terms of resilient recovery. And for that, we need types of collaboration that are probably not as developed as they should be. So yes, we are one of many institutions, one of many international organizations that deal with ecosystems and biodiversity from one perspective. There are many others, but we're overtaken by events, and we're playing catch up all the time. So now we have to see, I mean, whether COVID-19 and this link to zoonosis, the sourcing of the disease from an animal source, how does that become a new priority in our consideration of resilience at a national level, but beyond the national level as well? And how do we collaborate with all these other institutions in order to do better? And how do we collaborate with institutions like your own, which are operating regionally, internationally, and nationally, but that are not governmental and not part of this international discourse? So yes, like I started, we said that we are in a situation where transformative change is needed, and that transformative change does not happen within one dedicated silo, but it is something that needs breaking these distances between the different entities and doing basically a better job at joining hands and collaborating together.
Right. There were so many things that you brought out in your answer. So one thing I remarked is resilience, that's been repetitive and something coming up all the time. And then the fact that biodiversity is interconnected, it's not in sectors, but it overlaps with everything. So how does this work? You have the national, you have the global work, but when it comes to resource depletion or impacts on resources, how does the transboundary functions happen? Do we have enough options to address this? And you mentioned the economic systems and scenarios to, go forward in addressing these issues. What does it look like, the world that would address these issues, in your opinion?
I think that's a very good question, particularly for this context, because, I mean, we know that ecosystems do not respect national boundaries, and neither do the problems that affect ecosystems. And yet the tools we have are either national or international, not global. So even in international settings, we're still dealing with individual countries that can negotiate, that can collaborate, that can compete. And then you have another player, which is multinational corporations, some of which are far richer than individual countries, and some of which have a lot at stake in products that rely on ecosystems, or actually even worse, that rely on ecosystem degradation. And so how do we bring all these players together in a way that ensures that we look at the collective interest rather than the individual interest? And the problem here is that the aggregation of individual interest does not amount to the global interest. So if you have two communities next to each other and each one is maximizing their own interest in terms of resilience, it does not mean that collectively they are not depleting their resources in ways that would compromise their collective resilience in the future. And we've seen this very clearly with oceans. So each country was progressing in the way it saw was best for it. And in the end, we were dumping all this waste in the ocean. It was not a sudden revelation, but it could have been predicted. But because this does not belong to a particular boundary of sovereignty, it suffered, and then there are feedback loops that come back to the individuals and the communities and the provinces and the cities and the nations that are unfortunately not respected in the context of decision making that we have today. So transboundary issues are particularly important in so many ways. I mean, you can look at migration corridors, you can look at shared ecosystems where actions in terms of land use in one country affect that of the other, and sometimes the effect is positive and sometimes the effect is negative. There have been a number of regional agreements. So for a particular river basin, a particular ecosystem, you could have a number of countries collaborating around that with a particular objective in mind. In terms of sort of a global outlook to this whole thing, like now we're looking at a global pandemic. It's not localized. It's not, you can't pinpoint it to a certain sector or a certain region. It is spread like wildfire. Global mechanisms, not international mechanisms, but global, that look at the world as one whole, are yet to be developed to give us the maximum benefit from the potential for collaboration to at least preempt and build capacity for these things not to become as harmful, let alone to respond after a problem happens. So perhaps one of the persistent manifestations of the problem is the way we account for progress. So at a national level, you have GDP, and there's very little in there that accounts for the gradual ecological degradation that might happen, let alone accounting for regional or global impacts of this degradation. And nowadays, you know, a lot of our decisions are determined by numbers, whether it's cost-benefit analysis, cost-effectiveness analysis, etc. And those decisions are made based on mostly financial and economic considerations. The whole notion of quantifying the impact, the longer-term impact on ecosystems is just barely there. It's mostly absent. Of course, the other problem we have is that a lot of the activities that relate to the conservation and sustainable management and restoration of ecosystems produce their benefits over a very long period of time. So it's even difficult to justify it when it's at a national level. What if the benefit is collective and does not appear on any individual country's balance sheet, like cleaning the oceans? How do you account for that financially? So there's several things we're talking about. One is creating the mechanisms that give priority to the well-being of the actual ecosystem rather than the priority of the individual countries that are making decisions. And two is finding ways of proper accounting, maybe not using numbers, because we know that some of these things are very difficult to quantify. What's the cost of a loss of a species? You know, a tree and all of that, that kind of natural resources. There are methods in sustainable development economics, but they do not trickle down to our normal national income accounting. And so finding a way that either improves on the notion of benefits, economic benefits, as far as it contributes to decision making is one thing, and finding and making sure that this way is dealt with in a transboundary fashion. It's not about my country benefiting alone or that country benefiting alone. Maybe collectively we can achieve a synergy that brings you 1 + 1 = 3. And the second thing is ensuring that we have this collective outlook. So the ecosystem itself, or the river itself, or the mountain range itself, is given priority as something that needs to be preserved, not because we like it, but because in the end, in the long term, it also enables us to survive as a species, as a humanity. That's the second thing. The third thing is to dispense with the notion of the prisoner's dilemma. What we see a lot in international relations is maybe one player would say, I will only do it if my neighbor does it first. Or why should I do it? You did it first. It almost reminds you of your children when they're playing outside. But that's how, unfortunately, politics works in some cases, where even with something as critical and as existential as the health of our natural support system, you find this conditionality coming in. You know, I will only act if 1, 2, 3, 4 are fulfilled. Almost cutting your nose to spite your face, basically. So applying a context where we have a situation where we are all rallying around the health of the ecosystem, no matter how many boundaries it crosses, and irrespective of the impact of these boundaries, is, I think, a very necessary transition that has to be made in global thinking at the moment. And I'm very glad you asked about the transboundary impact, because we cannot address the issue of ecosystem health without realizing that that floods do not stop at national boundaries, droughts do not, storms do not, etc. And the response has to have the same fluidity and the same agility to not be hampered by the challenges imposed by these lines that we draw on the map.
So do you think that having these countries not by the borders itself, but more of ecosystem-based identification to have how the impacts would be and then the resources would be managed would be a way to go forward in this? And also coming to how we value ecosystems, I think there are some cases at national level in India, I think, where they've given a value to the Ganges or like an element of existence as a live element. So there are certain initiatives that are there. How do we scale these up to have a larger impact? Might be a way to, you know, think through for the next years to come. I'm going with that if you have a comment on it. And also, since I know that you're working on something for a while now, which is very close to your heart, if I'm not mistaken, the Resilience Frontiers program. And in our discussions on this, these have been coming up. People have been talking a lot on cross-boundary things. So would you like to give a bit of, you know, introduction and how biodiversity comes into play in the work that you do on it?
Absolutely. I mean, the idea now is that we're at a phase of existence where not only we're facing all these hazards that we've been talking about, and that our mode of economic activity has failed to prevent all these ills from coming one after the other. And there's no reason to assume that after we've limited greenhouse gas concentrations, and after we've found a vaccine for coronavirus, and how we've after we've closed the ozone hole, etc., that new things will not come up. And so the basic thinking as we move into the future, which is the core element of the Resilience Frontiers initiative, is thinking beyond 2030, is to start assuming that the SDGs have been implemented. So that's so that we don't have a constraint on our thinking by saying, oh, you know what, but this won't be there anyway. But even if they're implemented, we still have the unsustainable mode of life that continues churning out all these ecological ills. So seeing climate change, seeing species loss, seeing ozone depletion as symptoms rather than as the real disease is very helpful in this context. That's one principle that let us think deeply of what is producing these things. And we know they're bad for humanity. So it can't be, it's not compensated for by prosperity or anything, because like I often say, we think we're eating the golden egg, but we're actually eating the goose that is laying the golden egg. And eventually the goose will finish. There's still some of it left. And so one of the things is basically, what is that disease? What in our lifestyles needs to change in order to stop, not just to stop degradation, but actually to work with nature to give us more prosperity. The whole limits to growth argument by the Club of Rome, which was discredited, but then now we have a notion called planetary boundaries. But I contend that we can expand planetary boundaries through sustainable action. We know that you can do regenerative agriculture that can actually increase the amount of soil available. You could enhance the potential of nature to support humanity in better ways. So I'm not for just do no harm. No, it's not just do no harm, but actually do good. And so transforming the mindset from a reactive one, oh, let's try not to be bad, to actually try to be good in a way that eventually is not altruistic because we benefit. So that's another thing. And one other basic tenet of the thinking of resilience frontier is that imagine the Earth is one unit. Yes, we know there are boundaries and countries, and we get to that after we figured out what is best collectively for the Earth. Fortunately, there are enough people thinking of the national level context. And so it's not like we're leaving something that will never be discussed, but thinking globally rather than internationally is another major tenet here. And then finally, the fact that we have a massive technological paradigm shift coming upon us with AI, with blockchain, big data, biomimicry, other forms of biotechnology, drones, etc., blockchain. There's so much happening. It's all coming together to reform the world in ways that obviously, if left to their own accord, will be ways that enhance the bottom line of those who will purvey the technology and benefit from it. But how about, as we're thinking of transforming the world, we also take advantage of the fact that the world is being shaken up due to frontier technologies, and use the frontier technologies to help with moving ahead towards that better world. And we have 8 pathways, some of which are very relevant to the topic today. So in terms of revisioning our interface with nature, producing lifelong learning context that would enhance that interface, building on indigenous knowledge, because as we know, we've messed up in 200 years, but indigenous peoples have been there for a far longer time with lifestyle mechanisms that have enabled them to flourish, and also for their natural support system to flourish. So there's a lot to get from the values, not necessarily just the practices and knowledge, but the actual values. If you transform that to our modern lifestyle, there are a lot of lessons to be learned. And we actually had a workshop on that produced very good results. And so this thinking is going on. We have a road mapping phase this year where we will come up with the 1, 2, 3 most important recommendations for each of the pathways. So the top level, upstream, most impactful actions that can actually start the ball rolling and produce an irreversible move towards that better world, which would save humanity and save its sustainability and prevent that dangerous path towards extinction that we are embarking on.
Right. So we are actually running out of time. I know you have to move. But any closing remarks? There are a few questions coming in. Maybe I'll send them to you and you could answer them, and we could connect those to the people who have been sending them in. Very grateful for your time, and any closing remarks on what we are doing today and the biodiversity aspects and climate action.
No, thank you very much. Of course, today is a special day for biodiversity, and it's good that we're talking about these things. But I mean, the role of civil society and NGOs cannot be overestimated in this type of thing, because the whole idea will not come top down. I mean, the solution, the transformation, it has to be a massive movement. It has to be bottom up. It has to be from those who understand ecosystems, who are working with it every day, who actually have that relationship. So building the awareness bottom up to educate people like us, those who are working in policy making internationally and others, I think is the first most important step to fixing that broken interface between humans and nature.
So thank you very much, Dr. Youssef Nassef, who's based in UNFCCC Secretariat in Bonn, in Germany, for joining us, and all of you who joined us from Facebook Live. And the questions that are not answered that have been sent across, we will transfer it to Youssef, and hopefully he'll have time to answer them later. Thank you, Youssef, and thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.